Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Carolyn. So as you've heard, I'm Claire Fry. I am a preventive conservator, but I have one of my interests is emergency planning. I worked for English Heritage for many years, and one of my roles there was to make sure that the 120 sites with collections had adequate emergency plans. Then since working with Spencer and Fry for the last 5 years, we've worked with English Heritage, National Trust, many private houses, several museums. We do lots of work with the British Museum on their emergency planning and salvage. So that is why I will be here talking to you about emergency planning today. So what we're going to cover today is essentially the stages of emergency planning. It's not just writing a plan, there's more to it than that. The types of emergencies we should be thinking of when we're emergency planning, why bother planning, what makes a good emergency plan, how to test a plan, and actually what the requirements are, or what is required, sorry, typo, for accreditation and benchmarks. Emergency planning is a huge subject that can take days and days to go through fully. So this will be an overview, but if there is anything you really want to be covered, please add to the chat and I will try and incorporate anything if I can. As Carolyn said, there will be breaks throughout the session, so please put in any questions that you may have, or if you have any experience yourself of dealing with emergency and have anything you'd like to add, please do so. The more you put into this, hopefully the more you will get out. There will be handouts for this session that will be sent to you afterwards, so if I talk about resources or websites, you will be sent all that information. But the reason it's being sent out afterwards is that I will take notes during the session. So if anything comes up that aren't in the handouts, I will add them in before they're sent out. So to begin, so there's different stages to emergency planning. The first is essentially assessment. So thinking about your museum and actually what type of emergency you might be facing. Just to say today, I'll be talking about emergencies. Some museums use different terminology. They talk about incidents or crisis or disasters, but just for the ease of today, I'll just talk about emergencies to sort of cover all types of incident emergencies. So thinking about what you might be facing is the first step. So when I worked in America, I spent lots of time making sure stores were safe for tornadoes and hurricanes. Luckily in this country, we don't have to worry about that quite so much. So if you have a museum near a river, you might put a lot of thought into flood prevention, for example. Then the next step really is thinking about prevention. Prevention is better than cure. So if you can stop an emergency from happening, that is a lot better than having to deal with it. We then move on to preparedness. And that really is the essence of today. So thinking about an emergency plan, putting measures in place to help you should something happen, so that when you do have to react, you have all the resources and information you need to help you deal with anything that you have to face. The next step of emergency will be recovery, getting the museum back open, conserving collections, they can go back on display. And then finally, you should end with a review. So if something does happen, even if it's a small leak, you review how your emergency plan worked and if there's ways that you can improve it, if there's more information that you needed. So we're just going to think types of emergency. So if anybody wants to put in the chat what they think could be an emergency, we'll see if anyone's listening or if they've watching Netflix or something else. Does anybody want to put in the chat what they think an emergency could be? Fire, absolutely. Flood, fire, great. Thank you. So essentially, absolutely right. We have things like fire, flood, earthquake, theft, absolutely. Vandalism, tornadoes. I did just say that we don't really suffer from earthquakes and hurricanes in this country, but when I worked at English Heritage, Dover Castle did have a small tornado hit it, so that was quite exciting. Absolutely, Brian, we can also have storm damage, terrorism, building collapse, chemical leak, mold outbreaks, some people are now classifying as emergency, landslide, gas leak, metal theft, and then something that a lot of people now are adding to their emergency plan is dealing with a pandemic. So pipe burst, absolutely. All these things are fairly sudden, but could do a lot of damage to your building and collections. So when we think about emergencies and what might happen, we don't have a lot of information what museums have dealt with, not reported, which would be very interesting to sort of statistics for that. But oh, my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can still hear me. I'm just.
We had a brief wobble, but I think it's fine now.
Okay, good. 19th century gas pipes releasing cyanide. That's one I haven't heard before. That's very exciting. Well, probably not exciting when you have to deal with that, Caroline. So we have got some statistics, and I borrowed this idea from Kate Hebditch, so thank you, Kate. And a survey was carried out between, well, coming up to 15 years ago, to see what kind of disasters museums had faced. And these were the disasters they faced, and these are the statistics of how often they occurred. So what do we think from that list? And in fact, sorry, I think there's one missing. It's one, well, I've done the first one for you. Sorry, that's my my PowerPoint. So, oh no, we haven't. Sorry, this is me having two screens and having different slides on screens. Sorry, please bear with me. So, of that list, what do we think is the least likely, if you want to put in the chat, to occur? Has anybody got any ideas what they think would be the least likely to occur instance? Yeah, Sue, so you're absolutely right. So a terrorist threat or bomb incident did happen, but it's the least likely. And we do know that there have been plans to attack museums. So in 2018, there was a plot to try and bomb the British Museum. So it does happen, but luckily it's fairly low, down at 2%. What do we think is the next least likely disaster to happen? Fire, it's not fire, but that's a good guess. Theft, not quite, so you're almost there. So the next least likely was vandalism. I was giving a similar talk and someone said if you count school children drawing on things in pencil, it should be a lot higher. But from the statistics, it did come in at 3%. So again, vandalism does happen. This is Chiswick House, and there's a set of Sphinx statues, and fairly often, or it used to fairly often happen, that one of the heads got knocked off. Bizarrely, they always choose the original, not the facsimiles, which is a shame. So that happens. Paintings quite often get attacked. So I'm sure you'll know that this is the Night's Watchman, and that's been attacked 3 times, twice with a knife, once with acid. Sometimes museum collections can be targeted because they're political. So this is a statue of Margaret Thatcher in the Guildhall in 2002. She, well, not she, but the statue had the head knocked off. The slightly worrying thing for me is that the person who did this snuck in a cricket bat, but could not knock the head off the cricket bat, so instead used a stanchion, and the stanchion did knock the head off. So whole debate there about stanchions. This was the Tate, one of the Rothkos was written on in an act of yellowism. The person who did this got 2 months in prison. And then I'm sure that many people watching the news last week, and when people stormed the Capitol building in Washington, there was threats that they wanted to burn the ballot boxes. So not only did it obviously contain the votes of the American people, but the ballot boxes themselves are historic and incredibly important. This is Pompeii, where a recent excavation had uncovered this room, and with the people had already started scratching and graffiti. And then people just sometimes don't respect collections. So this is the pocket pistol at Dover Castle. It's called a pocket pistol because it's really big. It's a bit of a 16th century joke, but it was built in 1544, presented to Henry VIII. Really important object, but every day we have to take, or when we're in heritage, had to take out rubbish because it's displayed next to a cafe. So vandalism does occur. People don't always respect the collections as we would hope they would, but that's at 3%. So what do we think is next at 6%? Any ideas if you want to put them in the chat? Yep. So some of you are correct. It is theft, comes in at 6%. So theft can be opportunistic. Someone sees something and they take the opportunity to put it in their pocket. However, theft can also be incredibly organised. So senior policemen have said the theft of art and antiquities is now second only to drug dealing as the most lucrative crime for organised gangs. So there are some people who want to steal art and antiquities who are very serious about it. This is the Isabella Stuart Gardening Museum, and in 1990, 13 works of art were stolen by 2 people dressed as policemen. And it's quite emotive if you visit there because the empty frames are still on the walls to remind people of what happened, and in the hope that one day the paintings will come back. They haven't yet. But there's been more recent thefts. So 400 Viking objects stolen in Norway, the Swedish crown jewels stolen, the Dresden Museum that got broken into, and close to home, the Portland tiara was stolen a couple of years ago. And again, this was really well thought out, really well organised. And the tiara was in a really good, high quality museum case that we thought could withstand attack for at least half an hour. But if you watch it, and there's videos on YouTube, they get in there fairly quickly. So theft, what do we think is left now? So what do we think comes in at 10%? Well, actually quite a lot of you are right from the last session. So, oh no, actually you're right, Greta Fodder. So it is other, which is quite a wide remit from building collapse to IT failure. But building collapse does happen. This is the archives in the city of Cologne. And in March 2009, the building just collapsed. It is thought to be caused, but I don't know if it has absolutely been proven, that it could be linked with the construction of a new subway line nearby. But in this event, 90% of the archival records were buried. And at the time, it was estimated it would take 400 million euros to conserve the collection. So building collapse does happen. And when something like this happens, people, well, you know, I just think, how can you plan for that? How can you have an emergency plan that could help you deal with just suddenly your building collapsing? But perhaps one of the most unexpected events was September 11th, when 2 planes flew into the Twin Towers in America. And shortly after this, a report was commissioned by Heritage Preservation called Cataclysm and Challenge: Impacts of September 11th, 2001 on our national cultural heritage. And they found that although the events of September 11th were caused by an unprecedented act of terror, we found that standard proven emergency management plans and responses turned out to be the most effective way of dealing with disaster. So I'm sure that none of the museums had a plan for what to do if a plane or planes flew into the Twin Towers, but they did have information about what to do if there was a chemical leak or a fire nearby. So one of the museums had information that if there was a fire or contamination in the area, they needed to turn off their air conditioning. And they had information on their plan how to do that. They had to do it mechanically, and they had information how to do that, so they did. and they probably saved their collection from being covered in the dust and all the sorts of things that were in the air that day. So having an emergency plan is a good thing to have. So 2 left, and we've got 11% and 68%. So what do we think comes in at 11? Yep, you are all absolutely right. Fire comes in at 11%. So fires do happen. So here are some that happened in the UK fairly recently. Glasgow School of Arts, in fact, had another fire after that. Clarendon Park, National Trust Building, Human Museum in London, and Battersea Arts Centre have all had fairly bad fires. Of course, recently, Notre Dame also had a terrible fire. And if any of you are looking for something to watch, BBC Storyville did a really excellent documentary called The Night That Notre Dame Burned. And it's very interesting talking, they interviewed the people from Notre Dame and the fire service, and they talk about the events of that night and how they salvaged collections. And actually the fire service were quite frustrated that there wasn't more information, there weren't plans, there wasn't information on what objects should be salvaged. So I will put the link for that in the handout, or it is in the handouts already. And of course, fire can be fairly devastating. This is the Glasgow School of Arts, the Mackintosh Library before the fire and after, and Clarendon. This is the Marble Hall before the fire and after. So obviously fire is a terrible thing, but it comes in at 11%. So I'm not going to ask you because it's fairly obvious, but actually 68%, over 2/3 of the incidents, the disasters that the museums had actually suffered was water damage. And the reason I talk about this in the statistics is that lots of people write their emergency plan for a fire, and it's good to have information that would be useful for a fire, but we also need to think about water damage. So what are we talking about when we talk about water damage? It could be a flood. There's been some terrible floods in Florence in 1966, Prague 2002, and Paris 2016 that did flood museums. We're seeing problems from increased rainfall. So we are, whether you believe in climate change or not, we are getting these heavier, shorter bursts of rain, and sometimes buildings can't cope with that. So I know English Heritage and the National Trust, they've had to change things like gutters and downpipes to be able to accommodate more rainfall in a short space of time. We're also seeing more surface water flooding, and I speak from bitter experience because my own house flooded from that, where we're just building more and more and there's less ground for the water to soak into, and so it's just flowing down until it finds somewhere to flood. But usually it's either internal plumbing that's been worked on or hasn't been looked after, or gutters and drain pipes just not being looked after. And I know of at least one property, or I can think of several, but one property I know they decided to save £300 by cancelling the contract for the person to come and clean out the gutters each year. Gutters got blocked, they had a flood, and the damage to one of the historic ceilings resulted in tens of thousands of pounds worth of damage. So it's worth cleaning out your gutters. Not a glamorous job, but really worth doing. So just very quickly before we go to our first question and answer session, prevention is a huge subject, but just to give a quick overview, how can we prevent emergencies from happening? Maintenance of the building, cleaning those gutters, making sure your building is sound, any flat roofs are cleared, really, really important. Building work is a time when your collections are very susceptible. Cutty Sark, Hampton Court, Windsor Castle, all burnt down due to building work taking place. Also plumbing, I think Apsley House had a flood because they were working on the radiators and they cut through the wrong pipe. So there was a big flood from that. Wish I hadn't said that now because it's been recorded. Anyway, so maintenance of the building, keeping an eye during building work, having things like hot works permits, checking work off at the end of the day, and then making sure you've got good detection. So smoke alarms, leak detectors. So if anything does happen, you pick it up as soon as you can. For fire, it's just worth thinking about electrical loading. So this is historic property where they had a water cooler, a fridge, a kettle, radio chargers, several things all plugged into a single socket. To be fair, it was pat tested, but that probably wouldn't help them. It's also next to a chemical cupboard. That's the sort of thing that should be picked up in a risk assessment. And if you want to check the loadings for sockets, the London Fire Service has a socket overload calculator. So you can virtually plug in different appliances and check that they are not going to be a problem. The other thing is just think about fire loading. So this is a museum where they put all their old boxes in the basement. So essentially building a bonfire into their collections, or in fact in their collections. So that would really also promote fire spread. So just thinking a little bit about that. And then finally, I'm sure we've all done it, where we've propped open a fire door, but this is the Duchess Amelia Library in Weimar, Germany. They had a fire, and you can see the two sides of that fire door. So one side is complete destruction, and the other side is the books are still on the shelves and okay. So just making sure that any compartmentation is looked after, and fire doors are shut. So that is just a very quick run through of types of emergencies and a very, very quick summary of how to prevent them before we move on to emergency plans. But at this point, does anybody have any questions, or does anybody have anything they want to add?
Hi, Claire, we had one person ask, just want to confirm that, will you be sharing these slides after the session? I know you're preparing notes.
There will be notes. I can share slides. Some of them are pictures that don't make a lot of sense, but I can share a handout of the summary of the slides. Yeah.
Okay. We'll give people a moment to put questions down if you have any at this point. I've heard something recently, and I just wonder if you've heard anything from your conservation point of view, but I know in the Southwest, some museums have become aware that their fire service have changed their response procedures, so that they're only responding to alarms if there is an on-site verification that there's a problem. And I think this is owing to kind of cuts in their own, budgets and so forth. Now, during lockdown, if museums are left unattended for large parts of the day, there's no one on site to kind of verify if an alarm is happening for real or whether it's just a false alarm. So one thing I've heard is that museums should just contact their local fire services to find out if that is the case for their own provision. Have you heard anything about whether that's national or just really localized?
I've heard a couple of things sort of to do with lockdown, but I think the first thing is that all fire services are slightly run differently. So what we find Kent Fire Service will do might be different to what London Fire Service would do, or Hampshire Fire Service. So it is worth finding out locally what the provision is. Yeah. Oh, I've heard about people losing their automatic call out because they've had false alarms. I haven't heard anybody say that they wouldn't have the fire service, that they said they wouldn't come out if they'd had an activation. Usually you have to have a double activation to get them out on those systems. But I think it is something about, I'm so sorry, my neighbours have an extension next door and all these people are trying to drop off a skip outside my house. I'm a bit distracted. So I think it really, as part of your emergency planning, you should be making contact with your local fire service. Some fire services have heritage liaison officers. So I know London Fire Service does, but it might be worth seeing if you do have a heritage liaison person. And I mean, obviously, if people aren't there and they can't verify if there is an activation, that's bad. So the answer is I don't know, but I think it's another reason to make contact with your local watch and just ask what the situation is. But I will also after this session, I will look into some of the fire brigades, and I've got contacts in some of them, so I will ask if that is a new standard thing. But at the moment, I don't know, but that is quite worrying.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's good advice, though, for everyone, just to, as they're, especially during lockdown, if your site is unmanned, to make sure that you understand what your fire service response is going to be. There is a question, just a technical question about the handouts. So are you happy for the handouts to be shared with people not attending the session? We have an island-wide emergency planning team, and it would be useful to share the slides and notes with the team.
Absolutely, and it's fantastic you've got emergency planning team. That's great. That's really useful if you make friends with other museums nearby and can all work together. That is fantastic. So yeah, absolutely happy for them to be shared.
And just a reminder, we are recording this session too, so we'll be putting up a link to the session on our website. So if a colleague would like to see the session, you can always refer them back, or you can come back to it if there was a section of it that you'd like to review. All right, I think that's it for the questions for the moment. So okay. I will.
Okay, so now we're going to think about moving on to preparedness, and a huge part of being prepared for an emergency is the emergency plan. And I have to be honest that probably 99.9% of the time, when I ask a museum if they have an emergency plan, the answer is the emergency plan is nearly ready, or it's almost ready, or we're going to be working on it soon. So I always sort of try and work out why people don't spend time doing an emergency plan. Some people think it's boring. I think talking about museums being on fire is far from boring, but it's not that interesting for a lot of people. Hopefully after this session you won't think it's quite so boring, but we'll see. Sometimes I get the response that it's a waste of time. It will never happen. We'll never have a fire. We'll never flood. I think that's, well, tempting fate really. I wouldn't say that. Some people say we wouldn't be allowed in anyway, so what's the point in having a plan? And you can't plan for everything. You can't plan for everything, but I think as we've seen from, I'll go back, from September the 11th, that actually having information that you can use to deal with any situation is really useful. And Spencer and Fry was commissioned by the Museum of London to carry out a survey over lockdown of museums in London and their emergency plans. And one of the things that we discussed was the pandemic. And one museum did have a pandemic in their emergency plan, mainly because they were part of a wider organisation that has to think about things like that. But several museums did use their emergency plan because they had information there about what to do if they had to close a museum quickly. Because it's museums, sometimes in London, they were thinking about terrorism or that sort of thing, but they had identified objects that should go into the stores or be put in a safe, what objects should be covered, and they had pre-agreed maintenance plans. So some museums had not thought about what to do about a pandemic, but they did have information to hand that was really useful when they needed to go in there and make decisions very quickly. Another response sometimes I get is it's not my responsibility. And I've certainly come across this in organisations I've worked for, that the Conservatives are told they have to write all the emergency plans. We say we can't write them all, we're a small team. It actually should be up to the people that manage the buildings. They all say it's not to do with us, it's collections. They pass it on to curators. Curators say it's not us, it's maintenance. They put it onto the buildings department. But actually, it's kind of everybody's responsibility to make sure that the collection of the building is safe. And I think I'll touch on this later, but the plans that always seem to be the best plans are the plans that have been done in conjunction with people across that organisation and people from different parts of the museum, or involving sort of more than just the person who's writing it. The final thing about emergency plans are it's really hard to prioritise for something that hopefully will never happen, and if it does, you don't know when it is going to happen. So I know that, well, I think everybody I've come across who works in museums are very busy, they've got lots to do, they have more to do than they have time to do it. So it's difficult to find the time to do it. However, now we do have a bit more time, or some people have more time, so this is a good time to think about emergency plans, and if you can just do a bit of work on them. And what seems to help as well is having one person, or having it in people's job plans, so they have a deadline. The next year they are to do a section of the emergency plan, so that seems to help. Just a little bit about you won't be allowed in. So this is a fire safety guidance note, and it's the London Fire Brigade, so I know it's not applicable for people here, but they do have this guidance note, GN 80, and in there, I don't expect you to read this all, but the top 2 lines, wherever possible, the Fire and Rescue Service will attempt to facilitate salvage. Damage control is a high priority, providing cruiser fighters who endeavour to remove artefact collections from areas unsafe for salvage teams to access. Similarly, the Fire and Rescue Service can work in support of the salvage team when they have been authorised by the incident commander to operate inside the premises. So I think sometimes people think the fire service won't be interested, they won't help. Actually, it's in their guidance note that they should be offering to help. And if you do watch the BBC programme about Notre Dame, they did, again, they assigned a team to salvage objects from the cathedral. Although if you watch the programme, he doesn't look particularly happy about it, but anyway, they did, and they did take out lots and lots of objects. The second thing from this note that I think it's useful to read out is that the extent and value of the damage limitations teams, essentially the salvage team or the museum staff, the extent and value of their training will influence the confidence which the incident commander will have in it. This will directly affect the extent to which he will allow use to be made of the team. So essentially, if you have a salvage team and they're trained and you've had an exercise with the fire service, they are a lot more likely to let you in and let you salvage than if you haven't done any of that work. So I think that's just worth pointing out. So what makes a good plan? So I think sometimes writing an emergency plan can be really overwhelming. There's lots of information out there on the internet. There's lots of books about lots of things that you should put in or how you should go about it. But essentially, an emergency plan is just a place where you have assembled information that is helpful if you have an emergency. So it doesn't need to be any bigger than that. It's just you starting to think about if something happens at this museum, what information would it be good to have easily accessible for people? So it is better to have a good plan today than a perfect plan tomorrow. If you have a fire or a flood this afternoon, touch wood, hopefully you don't, some information is better than none. So just starting the plan, just putting a contact list together, just thinking, let's start, getting some equipment we could use. Anything is better than nothing. Preparing the plan is part of the process. And as Eisenhower once said, I always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. I'd slightly disagree. I think the plans are also useful, but actually sometimes it's really, really, it's incredibly useful to get people from different departments or different areas of the museum, or if you're a smaller museum, just to get everyone around the table and just start talking. What would we do if this pipe burst and there's water running through the museum? What would we do? What would we do? And those discussions can be very useful. And as part of the survey that we did for the Museum of London, something that came out was that during the pandemic, the museum did have quite a bad leak. All of the people that they thought would respond to an emergency, so the curators, the conservators, the people who dealt with the collections, couldn't get into London to deal with it. But because the person who was caretaking had been to all the emergency planning meetings, they'd heard the discussions, they'd gone through the plan, they knew exactly what to do when there was a leak. So it's really good to just have those conversations. There's lots of questions coming in, but I'm just going to leave them till questions and answers if that's okay. So what should be an emergency plan? I'm going to talk about a template which is on the Historic England website. I have to put in a disclaimer, I am biased because I did work for English Heritage and was part of the team that put this together. So that's why it makes sense to me. But I will put examples of other templates in the handouts. And this is the sort of thing that I would expect to be an emergency plan. So it starts with an evacuation procedure, contacts, plans, inventory of priority objects, information on salvage, information on first aid, and you will get these handouts, and I will go through some of these in more detail, and then some guidance notes on risk assessments, how to work with emergency services, and pre-done logs. So you can record decisions and communication, and you have an entry control log. What I don't think is useful in an emergency plan is things like records of maintenance to smoke alarms. And I have seen this, a great big folder stuffed full of lots of information, and only half of it is actually useful when you're stood there outside your museum, waiting for the emergency services to say that you can go in. At that point, I don't care the last time the smoke alarm was serviced, that's not important information. So it's information that you need at that point. This is, so Spencer and Fry is just an emergency plan for a big stately home. And we've worked with the graphic designer about how we could get the information across as sort of easily accessible as possible. So this is just some flowcharts, and it's a series of flowcharts we've put in because people react differently to emergencies. There's fight, flight or freeze responses, and I can speak from personal experience that when you are confronted with a museum full of water, for a few moments your mind just goes blank, and rational thought is not always there. So having some flowcharts that you can just guide people through, even as simple as, does the emergency require emergency services? Yes, dial 999. So you can just take them through the steps of what to do. And so flowcharts can be very useful, like a good flowchart. Contacts. So obviously in your emergency plan, you want to know how you can get hold of people. So internal staff, people who will come and help you, people who will wet vac throughout the night with you or move objects. But you also need to think about press and communications team, if you're lucky to have them, or who you need to contact about press, because the press will be interested, they will report on it. It's usually better that you can get a message out via your social media or website as soon as you can. And visitor services, if they need to start cancelling visits or stop that coachload of school kids who are about to turn up. You'll need information on utilities. Do you need to call the gas board, tradespeople, if you need a plumber, specialists, including conservators. And it's also useful, like we just heard in the chat, if you are part of a network. So if there are other local museums that can send people who are trained or offer you resources, space to store things, is all really helpful. There's lots of other contacts, which I will put in the handouts. So plans are really, really, really important. So if you need to get around the building or the fire service, or anybody really needs to navigate your building, and this is something that was very interesting, again, in the Notre Dame program, because I watched it the weekend, so it's fresh in my mind, that, well, they didn't say they didn't have plans, but they had, the fire service in Paris has an artist, and he was there sketching the building, so the fire service could work out where the staircases went and how to get around, which has prompted some debate within UK museum salvage groups about whether it's useful to have an artist on standby. But if you have a really good set of plans, then they would just have been invaluable in that instance, and they wouldn't have needed perhaps the artist. Plan should be a decent size, A3 if possible, if not A2. Laminated's good if there's water, if there's a leak, or if there's a fire situation where there's water. It's good to have 2 copies, so you can give one to the fire service if they need to respond, but you also have a copy for yourself. Plans should be clear, only information that's useful. So sometimes you get architectural plans, they'll have where fire sockets are, plug sockets are, or I don't know, lots of information that actually you don't need an emergency. However, you should clearly label what is useful. So stopcocks, where the fire hydrants are, where the compartmentation is. And ideally, you'd have a plan of a site with access information showing the fire hydrants, other sources of water, and then one for each floor of your building, again showing all the things that could be useful in an emergency. And also, I was going to say, I can't remember what I was about to say then, sorry. Oh, it'll come back to me. Oh, sorry, if you have any hazards, so if you're storing chemicals or there's gas cylinders or anything like that, they should also be on the plan so people know where they are. Priority objects. So ideally, there would have been discussion about what objects would be salvaged first. Again, that's a whole big subject, and I'm happy to talk about that in the questions and answer session, or if somebody wants to contact me after the training. But knowing what you should grab, and you can't assume that the people going in there to do this will know the collection. So it might be the fire service going in, so you need to give them a prompt about what to get. This is an example of a priority or grab sheet that I think is quite good. So you've got where to go in the building, where the object is in that room. A photo of the object is really, really useful when somebody that's going to know the collection. They might not know it was the chair who belonged to so-and-so, but there's a picture of the chair, that's the object you're going for. Dimensions are really, really useful. And this came from an exercise years ago at Hampton Court, where the fire service said even sometimes an image of a painting might not be useful, but if they know if they're going for something that's 4 foot by 6 foot or something that's 6 inches by 2 inches, that really will help them identify it. And then information on how many people can carry that object, if there's any removal or handling information. And it's always going to be a bit of a balance between getting things out and getting them out using museum handling, but ideally, if you can carry upright and lift under the frame, that would be great. Just a quick thing about priority objects. Some people identify the priority objects. So if things are covered up for winter, if you're a historic house, or if you have archives or things in store that are boxed, some people will put stars or other symbols on those objects just to help identify them quickly. Personally, I think that's a really good and useful thing to do. You just need to, again, balance that with security, because what you don't want to do is make it too easy for people to identify what's the most valuable things in your collection. Another area that's really useful in an emergency plan is thinking of a structure. So who will be in charge, what other roles are required if you do need to salvage. Again, if this is laminated and could be taken out and names put on, that's quite a useful thing to have visually for people when they're carrying out salvage. I would advise against putting people's names in, just because people leave, or people are allowed to go on holiday, and then if somebody doesn't turn up and that person is doing, somebody else is doing their job, and then somebody else is doing their job, it can get really confusing. So having a structure identified by roles, I think, is always quite useful. One museum I know, they do have pre-printed high-vis jackets with the rolls in the back. So people can be identified when they're salvaging, and actually the fire service, that came about because the fire service said it was very confusing for them to know who was doing what and actually who was in charge. So they asked for that salvage team to have high-vis jackets, and then they could work out who was the incident coordinator and who they should talk to. Sometimes in the plan it's also useful just to have a summary of the roles, just as a bit of a aid memoir in that situation about what that role should be doing. So a few other things, and again, this isn't extensive about what should be in the plan, but other things that I think are useful to have in there are information about salvage and first aid for collections. So just a reminder what to do if you've got wet books coming out, prepared logs, so you can fill in things about communication or have an entry log, inventory sheets. Documentation during an emergency is a huge topic and quite tricky because trying to record everything that comes out can either hold things up or it can be a bit of a tricky thing to do. There's different systems that can be used, but they've all got their pros and cons. Haven't really got time to go into them now, but if anyone wants to talk about that, I'm more than happy to. It's really useful to know what equipment you have access to. I spent once about 13 hours sweeping out water from a store and then mopping it up, only for someone to come in and say, would these be useful? And they were squeegees, and I think we could have done it half the time if they'd remembered they'd had them. But if there'd been a list, I could have seen that they were there. Prepared risk assessments are really useful. There are lots of hazards when you're responding to an emergency, whether it be a fire or flood. Human safety should always come first. There isn't any historic object that is worth risking your life for. But thinking about those risks beforehand, thinking about how they could be mitigated. Again, if you have, going back to roles, if you have somebody who's in charge of welfare, sort of looking out for those sort of things, that helps. But a risk assessment just to remind people the risks. And as I said before, people can go into freeze, fight or flight. And when people are in fight mode, the adrenaline's pumping, there's lots of other chemicals, and they take risks that maybe they wouldn't do in normal life. So it's really important to think about people's health and safety. You might want to put in briefings for social media, press, or the website, and then information there that after this sort of initial response about what people should do to leave the site safe if they are leaving it. There are other templates for emergency plans. This is the Harwell template, and it's the same sort of thing with different orders. So I would say that templates, I think, are a good thing. It's, you know, sort of a starting point. Essentially, you know, some of the work is done for you. There's some really good templates out there. There's some not so great templates out there. But it's really important that you think about your collection and your building and what information is needed and tailor those templates to make them useful for you. I think quite often people just see it as a desk-based exercise. They can sit there, get the template, fill in the information, and then it's done. I would argue that I think you know, one size does not fit all. You just need to amend them slightly to make them, yeah, useful for you. Right, I've seen there's a few questions coming in. So Carolyn, I don't know if you want to go through these.
So what we'll do is I'll read out the questions, gives Claire a moment to sip some water. I'll just go back to see where they start. So I think there's some comments peppered in with the questions. I'll read them out so everyone can hear them. So the first one, in terms of preparedness, when we had our chemical incident, emergency plan was fine for collections and building, but we hadn't considered what happened with a site locked down. There were no toilets, no food for staff and emergency services. So they hurriedly got the local pub to open and provide facilities. So yeah, I suppose it's about managing the situation in the moment is something to consider as well.
Yeah, that's a great comment. So that is quite common that those, and especially, you know, people are in this fight mode and they're going, they're salvaging, that they haven't thought about food, somewhere warm that they can rest, toilets, and all that sort of thing. So Caroline, did you revisit your emergency plan after that to have some kind of agreement with the pub that if that ever happened in future that you could access their facilities? Brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah, I have to say all the literature for mental welfare during emergencies says to avoid caffeine and alcohol. So which I always think is a bit mean, but I think keeping the pub open after you've dealt with the emergency would be quite good. But anyway.
And I guess it also points out that, you know, when we think, you mentioned earlier, quite often people think, well, it's not my job. Emergency planning should be the collections team or the conservators or whatever. But in an incident, you might need those extra support staff around to help with the welfare and to help manage the situation, the comms and so forth. So it is a whole team effort. The next comment is a question. So what are your thoughts on integrating the emergency plan with a wider business continuity plan, which will cover plenty more issues, but is a much bigger piece of work?
So I think it's really, really important that the emergency plan or salvage plan is part or is at least recognised in the business continuity plan. And usually business continuity planning and emergency planning can work together. There's some times where you need to do a bit of negotiation. So we've been working with a big museum in London about integrating their business continuity plan with their emergency plan. So and just having big discussions about at what point do you shut down a museum, because business continuity wants to keep the museum open and the shop open for as long as possible. If the collection's at risk, there's times that we would want the museum to shut, or for certain areas of the museum to be shut down. So there's sort of those negotiations, but then there's also negotiations about, if the museum is shut, access for collections care, but also getting laptops to people so they can work remotely. Can they remotely access monitoring? So I think they have to work together. The business continuity plan and the emergency salvage plan for collections have to work together. I'm sort of stalling because I have seen a plan that is a business continuity plan and an emergency plan in one, and it is massive. And I'm not quite sure this kind of tomb of lots and lots of information at that point would be useful, or how it would be used. But there's certainly people making decisions higher up after an incident for a whole museum and all its sort of areas, including visitor services, retail, that need to acknowledge there is a collection and there will be requirements for the collection that need to be considered in a big, massive event. I'll think about that a bit more and add some more, some better structured thoughts for handouts about that.
I mean, imagine a part of the function of the emergency plan is that it helps you manage a situation in the moment as well. So it needs to be something that is practical, easy to handle, easy, you know, really clear and practical. You don't want to be flipping through a telephone book of information unnecessarily in the moment of managing an incident.
Yeah, but there's things like during, the one thing I've seen is, you know, during an emergency, if the electricity goes, you'll go to backup generators. And we've had to argue that actually the environmental control system is a priority for electricity as well as the tills. Or I'd argue more than the tills. Other people are arguing the tills are more important. So it's just making sure that, you know, there's lots of things to think about. And again, it's about people sitting down and thinking about it and having discussions and what would we do. And sometimes people just don't think the same way as you. When you work with collections, you just assume everyone thinks the collections are important. And I've had a discussion where a manager of a site has said, we won't shut the cafe to release people that work in the cafe to help salvage, because then we'll lose income from the cafe in the event of a big emergency. So to me, that's quite strange why people are going to a cafe when your site is on fire or flooded, but it's just that kind of thinking that is useful to go through. So.
Okay, well, the next question was, how many people have a copy of their emergency plan logged with the fire service? And then some of the participants responded to that. So somebody said, we will do that once the trustees sign off the emergency plan. It's a good question. I think quite often people make their emergency plans and then it sits within the organization, and maybe, you know, sharing it obviously with the emergency services should be part of this process. Is that right?
So it's certainly really, really, really useful. And I mean, I think the first stage is just to make the fire service aware that you are a museum. So the Cumi Museum that I mentioned earlier, there was an excellent talk about the fire that was there. And one of the things was that in the fire service records, it was down as a council building, because it was council owned, it was down as a council building. So when they first started responding to the fire, they were dealing with it as an office. And they said, when they found out it was a museum, they had to change their approach. And had they known it was a museum from the start, they would have approached how they handled that incident differently. So it's useful if a fire service know your museum, or they know your heritage site, or they know you've got significant cultural heritage contained in your building. A lot of the fire service now, well, they would want your plans electronically. So they usually have on board computers where they can access information on the way to the fire. They, I think I might have a slide later I can find, where sometimes they have these instant command units that are amazing, and they have all these television screens and it's showing all sorts of information, and they can bring up your plans and show them on these screens. They can access it that way. There is a bit of concern about again, the security of saying, here's our most important objects, here's how you get them out, here's where the keys are stored. So some people or some museums have said to me that they have lodged their electronic emergency plans with the fire service, but they need to give the fire service a code so they can lock them. So there are all those sort of things, but again, different fire services have different ways of doing things. So again, it's another reason why it's really useful to talk to your fire service and about how they would want that information. Regardless of whether there's electronic plans or you've sent electronic plans, I still think it's worth having a hard copy laminated plans that you can give them on arrival as a backup if need be.
I know a lot of museums that I've worked at in the past, they have, you know, their master copy, a physical printed copy of their emergency plan, and it sits in the museum itself. So there is always that risk that there's an emergency and you can't get it. So presumably there should be additional copies offsite.
There should. Yeah, and copy control is really important. So you know how many copies you've got. So if you update one, you update them all. And then more people are going electronically. So so the contact list now, lots of museums have a WhatsApp or, you know, equivalent app that they've set up in case of an emergency, so they can put out a message on the WhatsApp group. Some museums, you know, join together into salvage groups, and they have a combined WhatsApp group, so they can share information that way. So some people are trying to have this information that, you know, they can have on their phone, that they've got photos or they've got documents on their phone. Again, it's just about copy control. So who's got this information, when it needs to be updated, how do you need to update it? But yeah, I think absolutely, to answer the question, the emergency services, if they've got as much information as, you know, the more information they have, the better it is, the better they can help you.
And there's one more question that I'll read out. So please, can you share advice about how many collection items to prioritize in a salvage grab on the lists? And advice about keys, duplicate copies of keys, security, and their locations for stores and display cases. And also just thank you, the Historic England template was really helpful that you shared.
Okay, so how many collection objects is always a tricky one. I think, and it's very difficult conversation. So I've done this a few times where I've been around Museum Historic House and there's a group of us, and the curator will say, in this room, the paintings are really important, and the furniture, and the textiles, and the silver, and the ceramics. So that's essentially everything. So I think usually people try to stick between 5 and 10 objects per space, but you can have different ratings. So some people have priority 1 objects, and that might just be the 1 or 2 objects in each space that are really the key things to go for. Then you have priority 2. So you can sort of divide them that way. I think it's also about being pragmatic. So one site, the priority object was a 16-foot marble sculpture, which there's no way we could have got out. So in that case, we had to think about how we could protect in situ. So it's not necessarily that you have to get the objects out. It might be that you are producing a salvage sheet or grab sheet about how those objects could be protected if they need to be left. Something that was quite useful from an exercise that I observed in the historic house is that the fire service were being sent in with grab sheets, and they came out with an object and then were given a grab sheet for the same room, and they said, why didn't you say there was something else in there? We could have got it at the same time. So you can have the grab sheets, but also sometimes it's quite useful to have a plan with all the priority objects sort of dotted on, or a sheet showing all the priority objects, so they can see if they're going in and they're going to a room that's sort of at the back of the building, they know that while they're there, there's other things they can get. But how many, it sort of depends on the significance of the collection. So, and what can be got at easily and what's vulnerable. So some materials will react, you know, they won't do as well in a fire or smoke or a damp environment. So you might prioritize things that you know, vellum, metals that you know would react and could be quite easily damaged very quickly. Advice about keys, duplicate copies of keys, security in their locations for stores, display cases. So again, I think that's a real conversation for you to have in the museum, and the security. I know that this is one that's had lots of debate actually at the museum that we're working with about duplicate keys. So it is that balance of security. So I'm not quite sure I can say what's right for your museum, but if you do have and it's kind of what Carolyn was alluding to, that if you can't get into parts of the building and that's where all your keys are, then you're always going to have problems. So some people do have something in a safe somewhere else, but it would probably be in the building because people don't want to have keys for cases outside outside the museum where, you know, and outside their security alarms. For historic cases, in some cases, excuse the pun, you have to decide whether actually taking things out of the display case is the best option. So for some modern display cases, if they're 11.3 ply laminate glass, as the Arts Council like, they can offer quite a lot of protection. They usually have a separate light box, so they usually have some protection from moisture. The ply laminate glass goes opaque when it gets hot, so it offers some protection from heat. So by the time you've got your display cases open, you might think about taking other objects on open display first, or you might want to cover your cases with polythene or a fire cover. So I'm not really answering that at all, Natalie. If you want to talk to me about this afterwards, I'm more than happy to talk about your specific case. But it's making an assessment about accessing those cases and accessing objects. But what you don't want to do is have all your labelled keys in a shed in the grounds that anybody could go into, where you also keep your emergency kit and your crowbars, because obviously that's not particularly a good thing. Sorry, I've gone all the way around answering that. I hope that's kind of slightly answered your question, but Natalie, if you want to contact me afterwards, we can talk more about your specific instance. But the Cumin Museum, they did smash cases to get objects out. And then there were shards of glass on the objects, and then people handling the objects were cutting themselves, and there was blood on the objects. And actually 6 months later, when they did go into that building, they found objects still in the display cases that were okay. So I'm not saying necessarily it's the right decision to leave everything in cases, but I think you should look at your museum, think about the quality of your cases, think about the vulnerability of the objects that are displayed in there. What's the risk? Is there fire loading high in that space? Is there lots of the building above? So you've got lots of problems with structural collapse. So I think it goes back to that assessment stage where you're really looking at your collection of building and what the risks are to help inform you about at what point you would start taking things out of cases. And yeah, display cases are always tricky to access. I don't quite understand how they can always make display cases that are so difficult to get into.
So I think that was all of the questions at the moment. So it is, just to give you a time check, it's about 12 after 11. So I think we should just go to the next section.
Okay. The next thing is about testing the plan. So the bad news is that you've written your plan, you're very happy, you've finally done it, the emergency plan is ready, but not quite. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to test the plan. So the first thing you should do is you should train your staff and volunteers so that they have the skills they need to follow the plan. So at the very least, this is introducing the plan to them and taking them through it so they know what information is there so they can use it. And ideally, you would give training in things like object handling, how to deal with damaged objects, because the idea is you want to test the plan and not your team. So you don't want to put them in an environment where they haven't got the skills to do the work and they find it a stressful, horrible experience. That being said, sometimes emergency planning is at the deep end and you learn from mistakes you make, but it's really not fair to ask them to test a plan that they've never seen before, before you're pretending that your museum is water pouring through it. So you train your staff, and then what is quite useful at that point is to have a tabletop exercise. So you're not having an exercise where you're moving collections or in the building. This is just literally sat around a table, talking through an incident. And this can either be formal, so you might have feeds, for example, so people are told a certain situation is happening and they have to decide what their next steps are, then they're given more information and they have to respond to that. Or it can be a game, and as part of the handouts, I will send you out a game that was developed by English Heritage National Trust and Historic England, and you roll dice and you come up with a situation and a time, and then there's wild cards, and it's just really a way of going through the plan, talking through a scenario and checking the information you need is in your plan, and then you update the plan. Then ideally you would have an exercise with or without the fire service. You may want to do your first exercise without, if you're a bit nervous about it, or you can invite the fire service. They will usually want to add in something that's useful for them. So they may want to test fire hydrants. They may want to put a fake body somewhere in the building for their firefighters to find, or they may want to, help with the salvage. So usually you'd put prop items in a room, you would sort of have fake salvage cards, and everybody would have a practice at putting on a PPE, going in, getting the objects, and then dealing with them once they're out. And it really is, I think, just useful for people just to have a go. So they learn what works, you learn what doesn't work. But I was talking to somebody who did have a fire at their property, and they'd had an exercise fairly recently before that, and they said the exercise was really useful because they just went through what they'd done in the exercise, and that's sort of when your mind goes blank sort of period that you have when you're first faced with something happening. It was easier for them just to remember what they'd done in the exercise and then carry out the same thing. So when you've had your exercise, again, at that point, probably in consultation with the fire service, you would update your plan again. And at that point, your plan is probably finished, apart from you will need to update it regularly. So if any collection moves, if there's staff changes, the plan needs to be updated. And that's why you don't want 17 copies all over the place, because every time you update your plan, you'll have to update every single copy that there is. So if there's time at the end, there might not be. I can show you the tabletop game, the disaster game, but you will all be sent a copy anyway. So at this point, I just wanted to very briefly go over that. I hope, and I'm sure that you thought this anyway, that emergency plan is a very useful thing to have. But we also need, if you're an accredited museum or working towards accreditation, they ask for a clear, workable emergency plan. So your museum must be able to respond effectively to emergency or disaster situations. This means having an emergency plan. It should cover all buildings and sites that house collections and services, and should include arrangement staff and volunteers, visitors, collections and collections information, a risk assessment of threats, how you authorize, maintain, communicate and test your emergency plan, and how you share it with your staff, volunteers and emergency services. So it's not just about having a plan, it's the fact that you have introduced it to the team and that you've carried out training, how the museum works with emergency services, a priority salvage list, and when you'll review your emergency plans. That's from the updated accreditation standard from 2018. Emergency planning is also part of benchmarks. So something that's quite useful, and I think it's been in the other training sessions, if you want to do an assessment of collections care and conservation in the museum, benchmarks are a good way of making a start. So again, you'll be sent a link to the benchmarks if you don't use them already as part of the handout. But here you can see, and I won't go through them now because there's only just 10 minutes left, but there's emergency preparedness for good practice and emergency preparedness for best practice. You can go and have a look sort of where you are within those benchmarks. I have to say these are the new benchmarks 3.0, and there's a lot of reference to British standards that are quite expensive to buy. So we have gone back to the authors and queried this. So hopefully that will be resolved for future versions. Okay, so at this point, is there any questions about training or exercises? I also have a sheet on the steps you need to take to organise a full-scale exercise, and again, I shall send that out with the handouts.
I'm just see that there's one copy here, one question here. So the issue with training staff, and especially volunteers, is we need to keep them trained up for an emergency that happens once in a decade. So you keep the training up twice a year, question mark. We decided not to use volunteers as we couldn't let them on site from a public liability insurance reason until the site was deemed safe. And by that time, we can just be telling them what to do rather than training them. So do you have any examples or advice on, for museums? This is a huge issue because I think most of the museums in the Southeast are actually volunteer run, or they have maybe one part-time, you know, paid.
So again, I think, you know, that's a fairly sensible decision. If you can't use volunteers because of insurance reasons, and I understand that it can be tricky, then that's a decision made. And in fact, actually, it's quite an important decision because it means the person who's trying to deal with a whole incident isn't having to make that decision at that point. You've already made it. Insurance is very difficult. I know that when I responded to an emergency once, well, very serious incident, I was 8 months pregnant. So my husband came with me because it was 2 in the morning. And then afterwards, I thought, my God, he's been running around this site with a step ladder and all sorts. So if he'd fallen down and hurt himself, or if he'd damaged something, then we'd be in trouble. So the way that that organisation got around it is, ironically, that we got anybody who turned up to sign up as a volunteer, and then they were covered by insurance. But I do understand there are requirements of public liability and a certain amount of training. it might be that there's lots of roles during an emergency that you don't need training for. There's someone turning up and going to the supermarket and buying bottles of water, or sounds a bit weird. I was talking to Stephen about incontinence pads this week because there was a flooded museum, and something that's really quite useful is kitchen roll incontinence pads that soak up a lot of moisture very quickly. So it might be somebody going and buying things. It might be somebody sat at the gate just checking who's coming in, who's coming out. But I think there are several roles that you don't need training for. Let me just reread the question. So if you think that you don't need to train them to do the roles that you envisage them doing in an emergency, I think that's fine. Sometimes I think it's all hands on deck. So you might just, how can you come in and just help us move this? So I don't know if it's worth sort of having a core team of volunteers that you think could be useful in that scenario. And quite often, sometimes when you're telling somebody to do something, they don't quite do it the way that you meant, and training can help with that. So I agree that if you can't see a role for volunteers, or there's issues where you can't use volunteers to do the salvage or to do the collection treatment, I don't know, I just sometimes think, you know, when you've got lots of wet collection and you're there and you've been there for 20 hours and you're drying it out and you just really want somebody else to come and start changing the blotting paper, that's when you're happy for anyone to come and take over, well, within reason. So I sort of talking myself around. I think if you've made a decision that for public liability reasons volunteers can't be used, then I perhaps there isn't point in training them, but I still think there's some emergency salvage planning tasks they could do.
Is there a difference between responding to the incident and then helping with the aftermath? So obviously the site needs to be secure so there's no danger for volunteers in the moment. So if there's a fire going on, you don't want your volunteers running into the building. But afterwards, when it's about treating the objects or trying to kind of salvage the objects, that's when.
Yeah, and maybe that's where maybe the collection's been salvaged and it's damaged or wet, and it is that you know, it can go on for days. In fact, actually, the recovery period of an emergency can go on for years. But that sort of trying to dry things out can take a long time. So you're right. At that point, probably they're in a space that's safe. So I actually do agree. You don't want to. I did do some training with the museum. You said that they would send a volunteer in to turn off the electrics if the museum was flooded, which actually I had to say avoid very strongly against, because there was lots of extension needs all over the floor that would be in the water. But I actually agree, you do not want to put volunteers or staff in a situation where they're at risk. So I completely agree. And in fact, Anna's added a bit more. I have done emergency awareness training with them, so they're aware of the salvage process, so they can be mentally prepared. Yeah, I think that sounds fine. I mean, even if it's getting people cups of tea and coffee, or that they can, because the other thing about sort of the welfare aspect of dealing with emergency is people want to feel useful. So if you have a volunteer who, you know, been there for years or not, really loves the museum, really loves the collections, and they want to help and they're told they can't and are turned away, that can be quite upsetting. And I mean, obviously you're dealing with emergencies, so you know you need to get on with it. But if you could say, can you just go to the supermarket and buy some biscuits or bottles of water or whatever, then they feel like they're doing something, and that will help them to deal with what's happening.
And for those museums where it's in the middle of an incident, obviously you need to rely on the fire services and emergency specialists in the moment to manage that.
Yes, at that point. So when the emergency services come in, they're in charge. They won't let you in unless they deem it safe to do so, and you listen to them and you do what they tell you. There's just a slight change when, if they do provide firefighters to help with salvage, even in exercises, the fire service come back time and time again and say, people weren't telling us what to do, or in the feedback, they were saying, oh, they weren't handling the collection right. If they're helping with a salvage, you can tell them, can you move this object? Can you hold it under here? So yes, but for health and safety, and when it's safe for people to go on site, you completely listen to what the service is saying.
So we've got two comments on this subject and another different question. So I'll read out the comments. One is like, I've done emergency awareness training with the volunteers. So they are aware of the salvage processes, so they can be mentally prepared to help, as it could be stressful for people, and then they can get help after. And the second comment was, the fire service said our emergency planning team should be aware of who's on site. And I think this is a really good point. There have been incidents of random people turning up in high vis to gain access to a site when they're not legitimately supposed to be there. Right.
So, so the first one, Anna, I think it sounds great what you're doing. I think absolutely right. I think the fact that you've had discussions about where you can use volunteers and what training they need, I think is all good. So I think that sounds brilliant what you're doing. Yes, absolutely. You need to be aware of who is on site. And that's usually why there is a role that is security, that is just people checking who's coming in. So random people turning up in high vis, it's like, yeah, if anyone turns up with high vis and a clipboard, people think that they are completely fine to let in. So it might be, again, you know, sort of what I was saying is that there is just somebody checking who's coming in or not, and if they have a staff badge or if they're known to the site. We've had more and more instances now of, even during exercises, where people turn up because they're trying to video it because they want their video to be on the news, or they want to sell images of what's happening. But also things go missing. So there was a stately home that had a fire. They had human chain. I don't like human chains anyway, but they had a human chain to take the objects out, and one human chain carried on, and some of the objects were stolen. So you are essentially taking your objects out of their secure cases, the secure museum. There's lots of confusion going on, so they're very vulnerable. So whether they want to come and film something or whether people want to come up and steal something, there is potential for people to come in. So you need to be aware of who is on your site for that reason, but also for health and safety, you need to know who's there. So if someone's missing, you are aware they are missing. So I think it's about cordons. You will have 2 cordons, one for the site, and you're letting people in and out who you know are safe to be there, and then one for the cordon that if you're going to the building and it's safe or not. So that was one of the things that we talked about, is logs that you can record who's in and out, or you can record who's on the site. And I think that, yeah, that if it's a major incident, then I think you're going to start getting the police as well. So it's working with the police service about how you can make your site secure. And I'm thinking there was a fire at Wardington Manor where one of the first things they got was Harris fencing, and they surrounded the whole site by Harris fencing. So I think the fire service saying that is useful information. And there will be people coming in. So the fire service were telling us about someone's house it wasn't a museum, but it was someone's personal house that blew up from a gas explosion, and the person was seriously injured, and they went the next day, and there was people going through the rubble with metal detectors trying to steal things. So yeah, you can't expect people to be nice, and you know, you will have to think about security and think about who's coming in at that point.
We have one more question, and that was, do you have any example lists of useful items for an emergency kit?
Yes, I do, and I can add that to the handouts. But again, I would say please make it applicable to your collection. So, for example, I know a property that had a book shoot made, even though they don't have any books, and so usually book shoots is a chute that you can put out a window. If you have a library on the first floor or second floor, and you can put the books down in bags, and it's a quick way of getting lots of books out of a building very quickly. But there was one on an equipment list. They bought it even though they have absolutely no need for it. So again, I think use the equipment list as a starting point, but look at your collection and think about what you need. If you've got lots of small objects, you'll need lots of crates. Yeah, so I will put in a sort of example list and ideas into the handouts.
Okay, and there are no more questions on the list. So do you have any sort of final comments or top tips, things to consider?
Me? I think you're asking the participants. I thought that would be good. Well, if anybody does, please feel free to put them in the chat. So I think people tend to overthink and be overwhelmed and be scared about emergency planning, when essentially it is just having a think about what you would do, what information you need, talking to other teams, and maybe it's because I'm doing lots of homeschooling at the moment. You know, just break down things into little tasks. So if you set up a WhatsApp group, an emergency WhatsApp group, next week, and hopefully you'll never need to use it, but if you do, then it's there and ready. So and then I think tabletop exercise is really useful just to go through a scenario. So it's 2 in the morning, or well, we haven't got the keys to that gate, or who does have the keys to that gate? Oh, so you just talk about you just talk everything through, and you know, and it familiarizes you with a plan. If anybody wants to talk to me about emergency planning, I love emergency planning. I really enjoy, but we do, as Carolyn said, have time for one-on-ones with you, or phone calls or email time. So I will add my contact details and handout notes, and I'm more than happy for people to contact me if they've got any concerns or want to discuss emergency planning, or another talk, or if you have to think about the security. But for other organisations, I do review people's plans or help them with training, and I'm more than happy to do that if people want to contact me.